open us in prayer tonight, and then we'll jump into, well, I did say 8, 9, and 10. That might be slightly ambitious. We'll see how far we make it, but let me just go ahead and open us in prayer. Dear Lord, I just thank you for this evening. I just thank you for the opportunity again just to gather. Just thank you so much for the study of Esther, for just all that you have shown us in your word. And I just pray that tonight would just be a continuation of that, that we would just be open to what you have for us, that we would just have willing hearts and ears and eyes just to be open to what it is that you're showing us. In your name I pray. Amen. Okay, so Addie finished off last week in chapter 7, and if you guys remember, it kind of ended really with a very climactic moment of Haman being hung on his own gallows that he created not for himself, but for Mordecai. And at the end of the chapter, it talks about the wrath of the king being abated. And while we know that that is true, and that's a very positive situation, it has not resolved everything for the Jewish people. They are still have the edict hanging over them, calling for their annihilation. And so we are yet to see that dealt with. But tonight we're going to change that and get to the end of what all transpires. Before we start into chapter 8, though, I just wanted to go back and review something I think we talked about in the first week. I just wanted to remind us of what God's covenant was that he made with Abraham, because we talked about how that's kind of what's hanging in the balance with one of the things hanging in the balance in the book of Esther. So, and I'll just read it to you quickly, but in Genesis 12, 2 and 3, he says, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." I just think that's kind of interesting to keep in mind as we go through these last 3 chapters and just kind of see what all takes place in that. So go ahead and open to Esther 8. I won't read everything tonight, but I'm going to go ahead and start out with this, and then we'll go from there. 8 verse 1, it says, "On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman." So we begin to see like our reversal of things here. Just a quick note on this too. When it talks about the house of Haman, what is implied by that is like everything that was Haman's. It's not just his lodging, but it's basically everything that was Haman's, obviously including the signet ring. He took that from him also, and also gave that to Esther, who then in turn gave all that stuff to Mordecai. And I think it's interesting, too. It's kind of funny that it says on that day. I mean, if you think back, this has been quite the day. There's been a lot that has transpired in this day. From what we can tell, it seems it starts with Ahasuerus having some difficulty sleeping, and boy, it just takes quite the turn from there. And but again, not everything has been resolved yet. So reading on, it says, "Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, 'If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?' And then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, 'Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. Yeah, no kidding. That's what got him into this mess. So as we look at that, it's interesting that it's kind of funny because it's almost like, the king is kind of like, I hung Haman, I gave you his house, you gave it to Mordecai, like, you guys are okay, like, you guys have this under control, like, what else do you want from me? But okay, fine, you have my signet ring, if you need to go write something else, go write something else, do what you need to do. You really see, like, the selfishness of, like, the self-focus of Ahasuerus here. I think his attitude is kind of like, what does it really matter to you? You're fine, what's the big deal? But that's not enough, obviously, for Esther. What do you see? Let's look at just the difference from when Esther goes to the king the first time. The first time she goes to the king is back in chapter 5 in verse 1. And I'll just read that quickly for us, so then we can talk about some of the differences. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." So that's her first approach to the king. And obviously here she goes to the king again. What differences in that do you guys see in the way that the two are described?
Seems like there's a lot more emotion in chapter 8.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting that it says Esther spoke again to the king and she fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him. And then it says he held out the golden scepter, which, if you notice back at the first time, it was like she kind of stood and waited almost for him to address her in that way and ask her what it was that she desired. And this time it's very clear there's a lot of emotion related in this one. You don't see that same weeping and falling at his feet in that manner. Anything else stand out to you about the difference?
I feel like before she was afraid of the king, and now she's afraid of what's going to happen to the king.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, that's a great point. I think along those lines too, it's kind of the same thing. Like you didn't see any mention of like fasting and praying this time. And it doesn't mean that she didn't. There's just no mention of that in here. There seems to be a much different attitude on her part too. And I think that's a great point about where her concern is for sure. What do you think, why do you think she showed so much more emotion this time around? I think maybe what you said is probably a good start to that, Jenna, with the concern for the people. It almost seems as if maybe her relationship with Ahasuerus, at least on her level, maybe feels a little more comfortable to her. I don't know, it seems like the banquets were at least, it seems like Haman and Ahasuerus were having a decent time until obviously Haman's came to a quick end that didn't turn out so well. But I don't know if maybe there was a little bit of that where there was just a comfort level there. Before that, it talked about how she hadn't been called to the king in over 30 days. I think she felt a little unsure of her position, and maybe to some extent this one felt a little more like they had been in communication with each other, obviously, now, so maybe that helped a little bit. I do think it's interesting, too. She definitely uses a lot more, flattering terms. And the first time around, it's almost like she's all business, It's like, what do you want? Up to half the kingdom. And, she is very businesslike. Just come to this banquet that I've prepared for you. Obviously, this time we talked about the emotion that's involved, but she also uses a lot of, if it pleases the king, if I please the king, if there's a lot more of that involved. And I think she's kind of in a little bit of a tenuous position here. I mean, remember, the edict that went out with the king's signature on it. It was coming really from him in that way. So she's got to be pretty cautious here. I mean, she doesn't want him to feel that she's in any way displeased with him. And she makes it very clear, like, hey, this is Haman. This is all Haman. It was him that put this out there. And apparently she kind of knew what to say in the right manner because, he does then give them the permission to go and make that second edict. I think it's also just another reminder, again, we talked about this at the beginning, she makes it very clear that Haman is their enemy. And again, this is something all the way back, Genesis 3:15 goes back to that idea of the enmity that comes from the woman and her offspring, and then the serpent and his offspring. This was something that was predicted clear back then, that there would be that tension, and you see that hatred of Haman played out in that manner. I also think I think Addie talked about it, I think it was last week. You talked about Esther being an intercessor for her people, and it was pointing us to, Esther is obviously an imperfect intercessor, but it points us to Jesus being that perfect intercessor. But also you see Esther just pleading for her people. She says, how can I bear to see the calamity that's coming to my people? How could I see the destruction of my kindred? And, I think that's interesting. Again, you see Ahasuerus really kind of seemingly caught off guard by that. Why do you care so much? And I just think in our own lives, I think it is a reminder to us, we may have salvation. We may be in a right relationship with God. Our concern, in the same way hers was also for Mordecai, it can be really easy if you feel like you have a right relationship with God, if you feel like your family has that right relationship, to forget that there are plenty of people out there who do not have a right relationship with God. And do we have that same, you see her weeping and pleading for her people in that way. And I just think that's such a great picture to us. Paul in Romans 9:1-3, he says, I'm speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience bears me witness in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. I mean, that's some pretty strong language. And Paul was very aware of what he was saying when he was kind of saying, I wish I was accursed and cut off from Christ so that they could have relationship with him. They would know relationship with him. And I just think that's a great picture of, as you think of Esther at the feet of Ahasuerus, pleading for that. So let's go on and look at these, what happens next, I guess. Would somebody like to read Esther 8:9-14?
I can read it.
Thanks.
The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed him with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. And on that on one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel.
Thank you. Okay, so here we see edict number 2 going out. I do have to say I don't know a lot about Persian culture, but I was a little curious as to why edict number 2 couldn't just say ignore edict number 1. Seems like if you're allowed to throw that stuff out there, that would have seemed easier to me, but apparently that was not an option. As we see here, it was very intentional the way this edict number 2 was written. Just for a reference, like this is around 2 months after the first edict was written, which is also kind of interesting. Just when you look at the timing of this, you remember you talked a lot about the lots. They were really intentional about casting those lots and making sure they had the exact perfect day for all this stuff to transpire. But, you know, as we know, this is God's sovereignty and God's providence in this. Like, we talked about how big this kingdom was. I mean, if the first edict would have gone out and it was to be carried out in a much shorter period of time, there would not have been time for the second edict to actually have made it through the whole kingdom. Remember, they mention it in here again, 127 provinces. So you see just even God's hand in the timing of that. He knew all of this needed to plan out perfectly so that they would have this opportunity for that second edict to be issued. Also, just one little note. The one thing that is one of the differences from edict number 1 to edict number 2, it mentions in this one specifically that it went out in the Jewish language also, which that apparently did not happen with the first one, which is interesting since it was so pivotal to them. So speaking about that, edict number 1 says, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children. So as you notice, that was pretty close language to edict number 2. Edict number 2 says the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. Now, I think there's a couple of things important to point out here. Number 1 is the very first thing it says is the king allowed the Jews to gather and defend their lives. Okay, this was not them being the aggressors. This was them defending their lives. They were under attack, and this was them defending that. I think it's actually and you see Mordecai putting this together. Mordecai does the wording of this, and I think this was intentional wording on his part to really answer exactly to the edict of the first edict that went out. And what he has actually used here is known as lex talionis, which is called the law of equal punishment. Now, we might be more familiar with the concept of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's actually what that law entails. And it's kind of funny because I think a lot of times we look at those things and I think that there can oftentimes be really incorrectly translated. You hear an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. To us, that kind of seems like, a kind of a nasty way to do things. But it was actually something that was put in place by God in the law, and it was meant as a way of preventing an excessive retaliation, overcompensating for being wronged. It was meant to actually curb violence, and it was meant to prevent a vigilante type of justice thing, kind of stop the tribal feud deal. And so, you have that thing where you see somebody is like, oh, you stabbed my family member. Well, I'm pretty ticked about that, so I'm going to go and I'm going to kill your family member. And then what happens, Now the family of the one who's been killed is like, you killed our family member. We're going to go and kill 2 of your family members. And the next thing, there's nobody left for anybody to kill because nobody knows where to stop. And so you see this put into place, this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, just being a way to have like a fair retribution for something that has occurred. So the intention was, you kill my cow, you owe me a cow. I don't get to go kill you. And that was the purpose of having that put in place in that manner. I think God knew people. And if you go back to Genesis 4, 23 and 24, in that Lamech, I don't know if that's how you say his name, Lamech, he actually is telling his wives and bragging to his wives, and he says, I killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So this was really put into place to prevent that type of a response from the people, and to have it be something that is fair. So as we look at that, does anybody have any other thoughts on anything having to do with the 2 edicts? Any thoughts about those edicts?
Did the first one say anything about plundering their goods?
Yes, the first one did say that they were allowed to plunder their goods, yes. I think, and I did not read that, you're right. I think it was in there. I could be wrong. Let me look. Oops. I was thinking that it did, and I was thinking that he answered exactly in kind. Well, I had it written down here. I think it does say that, but I'm not looking right at it here at this moment. I will look that up and we will find out.
I didn't remember seeing it, but
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't there.
It might, yeah. I was thinking it was too, and I don't know why I don't see it right here.
I don't remember it saying that it did.
Oh, yes, it does say that. And to plunder their goods. It comes after the month that it's going to occur in. So it's down in chapter 3 at the very end of verse 13. Yeah, good point, because I didn't read that part of it. And yes, it does say that they also have that opportunity to plunder their goods. Anything else stand out to you guys about any of that we've read so far?
This, their response and their edict that they write and send out just reminds me of just how they choose God's way of, like you were saying, like an eye.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas Haman, when he was wronged, he chooses
Yeah, exactly.
his retribution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Haman's like, Mordecai won't bow to him, so he's like, I'm going to annihilate all of you. Yeah, right down the path of Lamech. Okay, we'll just, let me read just the very end of this, chapter 8, and then we can see if anybody has any other thoughts on that. And then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So we see some differences. If we go back and look at what happened after the first edict, what the response is, I think some of the terminology used was confusion, sackcloth, ashes, and we definitely see a turnaround after this edict goes out. What kinds of things happen after this edict goes out? What are some of the differences in how it's handled? Yeah,
Afraid of all of us, or?
apparently. Everybody was partying, apparently, for the... Yeah, which is kind of funny because after the end of the first edict, I think it's funny, the king and Haman sat down and drank. They were excited. Not so much the response of everybody else. But this one, yes, you see, they're having a feast and a holiday. Anything else that you see that is a difference from the first one to the second one?
Well, I think it's interesting that they're like, well, now other people are declaring themselves to be Jews. And
Yeah.
before they're like, no, I'm not a Jew, I swear.
Yeah, exactly.
Now other people are trying to do that to protect themselves.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Which is kind of interesting because if you think about it, the first edict is still out there. That one is still valid. So the Jews are still able to be attacked, but now they can fight back. And so it's interesting that in the midst of that, they're like, we're going to align ourselves with the Jews. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a second too. But anybody else have anything else that stood out to them?
I had a question that we missed a couple weeks. Was there that many Jews? Like the ratio of Jews to?
That's a good question what the ratio was, because this was, I don't know, did you see anything about what the ratio to Jews to anybody else would have been?
They probably would have been fairly small.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking
Probably would have
too.
been fairly small, but I mean, we see in chapter 10 how it all turns out, how many people actually attack them.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
small number.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question though. I don't know what the ratio would have been. Yeah, that's a good question.
Converting to Jews already, it's like overthrown, or was it?
Yeah. How many is going to turn out?
We can assume maybe Jerusalem was one of these 127 provinces.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point too, because this literally would have been the annihilation of the Jews. This was, I think sometimes it's easy to get a little confused about that since it's in the Persian Empire like that. But yes, it would have, they pretty much owned everything at that point in time.
So I think the Jews probably had a few more enemies than just the Amalekites.
Yeah.
Who might have wanted to.
A couple other things that, first off, there isn't a response mentioned as to how the king responded this time, the first time he went out and drank with Haman. You see, the change in Mordecai, not before he's at the gate in his sackcloth and ashes, and this time he is coming out of the palace, out of being with the king. And he's, no longer outside the palace in that manner. Not only does he come out in that manner, but he's now wearing royal robes. He's got a gold crown. He's got another robe that's fine linen and purple. I mean, there's been a dramatic turn of events in that. You also see the response in the people. It's interesting that it says the city of Susa is rejoicing. So kind of to what you said, Sarah, how many were actually against the Jews at that point? It seems that there's even rejoicing in the city. Whether or not everybody was really on board with what Mordecai was doing, it doesn't seem to be that way from some of the excitement that has transpired. And the other thing it mentions is honor. And I think you all of a sudden have the Jews. I mean, Mordecai is now second in command. And then you have the queen. The queen is Jewish. I mean, the situation for the Jews has really taken a dramatic turn. And I think, as you said too, Amber, the idea of the fear of the Jews falling upon them. Actually, it's kind of interesting. If you look back in the book of Joshua chapter 2. Let's see, Joshua chapter 2, verse 8. This is actually the story of Rahab. But there's some similar language here that is kind of interesting. It says, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, and to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. I just think that's an interesting comparison there. You see some similarities in that story of how the people felt about the fear. I think it actually says, it says the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. And I was actually listening to Alistair Begg talk about this, and he said, I think that's such cool wording. Like, it fell from where? Like, where do you think that fear came from? I think that clearly that was the fear of God in that way. So, any other thoughts on chapter 8 before we move on? All right, going into chapter 9. I don't know, Addie, I might slaughter this one, but I actually have a literary term for this part of it. So I was like, if I get it wrong, you're more than welcome to tell me. But actually, chapters 9 and 10 are said to be the denouement, which is the term. How did it go ahead? Is that okay? Okay. Which I did not know before I did this. So, but it's the idea of their untying the knot. So everything that has been happening up until this point, now we're beginning to see the reversal and the untying of all of that. Just as an idea, time-wise, this is about 9 months to the day after that first edict went out. So, as we just read through a little bit of this, just kind of think through like some of the reversals that have taken place here, because that's pretty much what this whole chapter is about. I guess untying, what all is being untied. Okay, so I'm going to read this part of it real quick. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all the peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And also Parshandatha and Dalphon and Aspatha and Poratha and Aldalia and Aridatha and Parmashata and Arisai and Aridai and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they laid no hands on the plunder. I wasn't going to make anybody else read that, but so, yeah. All I could think in my head was Sam saying, come on, you can at least give it a try. I feel like he always says that in his sermon. So I was like, oh, I guess I got to work my way through this one. So, thanks. Yeah. Fortunately, they're not here to tell us if any of that was anywhere near correct. So I'll go with that. Okay, so reversals. Anybody see any reversals in that of things that were transpiring and are now slightly different, largely different?
The Jews killed their enemies.
The Jews got to kill their enemies instead of the Jews being killed. Yes, absolutely. Huge reversal.
Mordecai was great and not hanging out in the street.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's interesting, like we don't really know that anybody even knew who he was the first time around. And yeah, now there's actually fear of him. That's kind of crazy. Big turn of events. Anything else?
I think it's interesting, this last line where it says they laid no hand on their.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Because it's like then they had the option, like it was in the edict, they could have done it if they wanted to, but it's like they didn't see it as a need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it was very clear the intention was for them to defend themselves. And I think that it also shows how intense the hatred was of the Jewish people. I mean, they still, even though people knew they could now defend themselves, they still were attacked. I mean, a lot of people died. We're going to get farther into that to see all of the numbers. And I think that's why, sometimes we look at it and we're like, wow, that seems a little, to us, I think especially living in a society like we do, it seems a little extreme that they, went and they killed those who were going to kill them. But it shows the level of hatred for the people. And I think, if you allow that hatred to continue, it'll just come up again. I mean, this was necessary for them to have experienced the peace and not be under threat like that. Again, I was listening to one of the things this week that Alistair had to say. I mean, he compared it to the Holocaust. And he said, if you remove Hitler from the Holocaust, would that have immediately saved all of the Jews? Well, I mean, by that point, so much anger and fury had been fueled that it wouldn't have just taken that out of the equation to simply remove him in that manner. Any other things that stood out to you guys about differences? It's interesting that the first time around, the edict that goes out to all of the officials, the satraps, all of them, they were supposed to help carry out that first edict. And in the second edict, when it actually is enacted, they're helping the Jews. So you see a big change on their part for that. Also, it's interesting that Haman, one of the things that Haman brags about back in chapter 5 as he's going and talking to his friends and his wife, it says, Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, and all the promotions with which the king honored him. So I think it's interesting that there's a point made in 5 that there's 10 sons, and then there's a point made to list all 10 sons in this one. Just to show that, again, there's all the things that Haman put up as what he was proud of, what meant something to him. I mean, he's lost all of his splendor. It's now Mordecai's. His sons are now all gone. I mean, he's in essence had the death of all of his sons is really on him. And he's had his signet ring even taken from him, which was, again, all of the promotions that he had received from the king, the high status that he had, it's all gone. And it's been given to the man that he built the gallows for. So, yeah, what a transition. One thing we see that was not reversed, though. The events of the day are reversed, but the day itself is exactly the day that Haman planned for, that he cast his lots for. And it's interesting, in Proverbs 16:33, it says, the lot is cast into the lap, but its very decision is from the Lord. And that one didn't go quite the way that Haman saw that one going. So, again, I think it's just important, the Jews were not aggressors. They were under threat. If they would not have acted, they would have been killed. Back in Joshua 21:44, just a similar verse, it says, the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all of their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. And then the other thing I was going to just point out quickly, Amber, you mentioned the plunder. And If we look at 1 Samuel 15, starting in chapter 17. I really wanted to read this whole thing, but I don't know that we have time, only because I think this is such a great story. So just to catch you up quickly, this is where Saul is king right now of the Israelite nation. He's instructed by God to go and get rid of all the Amalekites and to destroy everything, which, interestingly, all this time ahead now we see kind of his failure to do that, where that has gotten us. And so if you look at verse 15, or sorry, if you look at verse 17, Samuel comes to Saul because Saul does not do what he is asked to do. And so Samuel comes to talk to Saul. And Samuel said, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" So God told him, destroy everything, take no plunder. And ironically, if you read down farther, Saul actually says, "I did exactly what God told me to do." Interesting, because you also did not kill the king that you were supposed to, and you took all the plunder. You just tried to cover that by saying, "Oh, I took it so we could offer a sacrifice to God." Interesting. But, I think that it's clear in these stories, there's obviously the Jewish people hear the stories that take place. You see them quoting different things. Like even you see Rahab saying, "We saw what happened in your nation with the crossing of the Red Sea." So we don't know for sure that had anything to do with why they didn't take the plunder this time around. But we do know that what Saul did in keeping that plunder at that point in time was wrong. And ironically, it was with, that's Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites. And so it was ironically with people from the same nation as Haman. So I think that people are very intentional this time about being clear. This was them defending their lives. They weren't seeking possessions. They weren't seeking something along there. They were literally just seeking their lives. Okay, so then we have, if we go back to Esther in 9:20, this is kind of the wrap up of what happens after the two edicts go out and the day takes place. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. Sorry, I did not read it 20. Let me start that again. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same year by year. You know what? I don't think I read the rest of that. Hold on. Sorry. I was like, wait a second. I think we stopped after Oh, no, we did, didn't we? Oh, no, I did not. I skipped verse 16. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. So while I don't know what the ratio was there. If they killed 75,000 people, there had to be a decent number of them, or else they were pretty powerful. Yeah. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th day and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. And therefore the Jews of the villages who lived in the rural towns held the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and in feasting, as a holiday and as a day on which they could send gifts of food to one another. And then at the end of that, we see Mordecai basically sending out letters to make, as Addie had talked about before, the Feast of Purim. and what that was going to be and how that was to be celebrated. And we see that at the end. I think I'm not going to read all of that because there's quite a bit in there, but both Mordecai and Esther send out those letters basically commemorating that as a holiday. And I think Addie described to us some of the things that would go on, hissing every time Haman's name was mentioned with their little noisemakers. And I think also, they ate cookies the shape of his ears? Did you talk about that too? Yeah.
It depends on what tradition of Jewish you are.
What it is?
Or his ears.
Okay. Ate something related to Haman. So, yeah. Okay, so we kind of went through that fairly quickly. We will have a chance next week to kind of, wrap up all of this and kind of talk about these things too. But does anybody have anything else that really stood out to them in chapter 9 that you wanted to talk about?
It talks about how many enemies were killed, but it doesn't mention at all the Jews that were killed. I mean, can't imagine that there wasn't any. Did you guys, in anything that you saw, like, did anything come up and say?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. They apparently felt like that was not critical to the story, but yeah, we definitely don't see that any are mentioned as being killed. Yeah. I mean, we do know that God is fighting on their side, so I'm assuming that if that was not God's intention, then it would have been a pretty one-sided battle. As you know, there's certainly a lot of other, similar stories back through the Old Testament where kind of that would happen where, it was incredibly one-sided. Okay, so 10 is very short. There's only a couple verses. I'm just going to read this for us quickly, and then we can just talk about a couple quick things. But King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles and of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke to all his people. So I kind of think it's just kind of that untying the knot. Like, the king's just kind of going back to business as usual. He had withheld the taxes for a while. Taxes are back on. You just kind of see him just kind of going back and getting back into life. I think it's interesting. Again, it's pointed out that this is written in the book of the Chronicles, the kings of the Media and Persia. Again, that's not Chronicles in the Bible, as Addie mentioned, but and we don't have a record of that. But it is clear that it was written down as a historical event. Which is kind of funny. If you guys Google this at all to kind of see what the consensus is out there about what people think about Esther, there's a number of people who are like, I really just think it's like a nice story in the Bible, but I'm not sure that it's actually anything historical. I'm like, that's interesting. They make more than one point of talking about it being written down as actually being a historical event in that way. So and obviously Mordecai, second in rank, and as opposed to Haman, who looks to, in his position, annihilate an entire race of people. You see Mordecai acting in the exact opposite way with the care, seeking the care and the welfare of his people. So huge difference for him on that part. Just as I just found it interesting. I'm sure you could pretty much read through a vast bulk of the Psalms and feel like they apply really well to the story that is here. But I just encourage you guys this week, if you get a chance, read the first couple Psalms, especially Psalm 2, but even 1, 2, and 3. They're not super long Psalms, but I just think it was interesting reading through those and kind of the talk of what happens to the wicked and also what happens to God's people. And we just kind of see that played out in this book of Esther in that way. Sorry, I know that was probably a lot. Next week, my plan is to have us do a little bit more discussion on our feelings through the whole book of Esther, just some things that stood out to you. So just start thinking about that as you're looking back over things this week. If there were things that you found to be impactful, or maybe something that, even questions that you have or something like that, we can look at talking about that next week. And also just continuing down that theme of just all the reversals that took place in the book, and kind of, we're going to talk a little bit about what do those point us to? What is some of the visual behind that of what we see being illustrated in that way? So, any other thoughts on 8, 9, and 10 before we end? All right. Does anybody want to close us in prayer? All right, I'll close this and then we'll head out. Father, I just thank you again for this night. I just thank you for this story that we have in Esther. Just all these years ago, Father, that your care of your people, your preservation of your people, just your providence and your sovereignty in their lives. Just thank you for the fact that we just have that to learn from, to be encouraged from, to have hope from, and hope of our one-day future final deliverance. Just thank you for this time. Just thank you for each person that's here. In your name I pray. Amen.